Well, welcome this evening to this conversation hosted by the Royal Academy at Masterpiece London. I'm Thomas Marks, writer and critic, and I'm delighted to be joined by Rebecca Salter, President of the Royal Academy. Rebecca is an artist whose meditative, meticulous work has been shown at the Yale Centre for British Art in London, in Japan, in Germany as well. We're going to talk through Rebecca's career, her practice, how she balances her work alongside her role as the President of the Royal Academy. I think I'm probably not going to give a huge biographical intro because I think things will come up and, as we talk.
As we speak.
So why don't we start off by talking about actually where you started out. You studied ceramics, Rebecca.
I did.
At Bristol Polytechnic. How did you choose that as the medium that you were going to study? And where did it go?
Anyway, very nice to be having a conversation with you, Tom. So back in those days, when you did a foundation course, you were able to spend a few weeks doing photography, a few weeks doing ceramics, and all those wonderful techniques that you'd not been able to do at school. And I really enjoyed ceramics. And so that's the direction I went in. And at the point that I graduated from Bristol, I still enjoyed ceramics. And I think we're going to come on to talk about this, I decided to go to Japan to take it a step further. But then once I arrived in Japan, things changed, and I went off in a different direction.
We've spoken before, and so I'm going to press you a bit harder this time, because I want to know a bit more about ceramics, what it was for you. Were you looking at things by Bernard Leach, by British studio potters?
No, because I've never ever wanted to make a teapot. So I was looking at things, when we were students, amazingly, when we went to visit Lucy Ree, which was extraordinary. So I was looking at people like Lucy Ree, Hans Koper. So that sort of generation of people who were moving towards sculptural ceramics. And that was, I never did learn how to make a teapot. And so that ultimately became the problem for me, because I reached the stage where I thought, well, actually, if you're not going to use clay to make something practical, if you're going to use clay to make a sculpture, then why is it called ceramics? Why aren't you in the sculpture department? And that's ultimately why I gave up.
And so you weren't making pots, you weren't throwing anything, you weren't making tea bowls and things, but you were building with slabs of clay and more interested in the surface than the form, or?
So for my degree show in Bristol, I built sawdust kilns, which means they were fired at an incredibly low temperature. And actually it means they would go back to mud if they got wet. And then I was firing very thin pieces of clay and then making them actually into things like screens. So I was always struggling with scale, because I always wanted to do something bigger, and then it would crack or the kiln wasn't big enough. So there was always a sort of mismatch with what I wanted to do, what you could do with clay. And ultimately that led me to stop doing it altogether.
When you left Bristol Polytechnic, am I right in thinking you threw all of your work into the creek?
I threw it in the River Avon,
like Colston's statue, rolling it into the creek.
And except mine's still there. I don't know, it's mud. But yes, I threw it away. Yep. And none of my ceramics. So my degree show I threw in the River Avon, and it went back to mud. You were
the Michael Landy of your day.
Yeah, I did it before. And then the work I'd done in Japan, I left behind in a sort of shed attached to the scruffy old building I'd been living in Japan, and that blew down in a typhoon, and so that was all smashed. So hardly any of it survives.
Well, I think we will talk a bit more later about things that are destroyed or lost in your work, and that is almost part of your creative process in some ways. But let's stick with sort of introducing you biographically. 1979, you moved to Japan.
Yeah.
How long is that after your time at Bristol, and what is it that spurs the decision to go to Japan?
So I graduated in the summer of 1977, and nobody in this room, except another person, is old enough to remember what 1977 was like. And it was, there were strikes, there was rubbish piling up in the street. I mean, it was pretty grim.
It was like 2022.
Like 2022. So the late 70s, in terms of trying to survive as an artist coming out of art school, were really tough. And of course, all my contemporaries were looking to New York and desperately trying to think, how can we get to America? Because New York was still the centre of the art world. And for some reason, I decided I wanted to go in the other direction. The reason probably was that I wrote my dissertation on the Tale of Genji Scrolls, the 9th century novel. And so I had this head full of sort of romantic images of Japan from Kyoto, particularly from the 10th century. And I just decided I wanted to go to Japan, but it then took, and again, this is pre-internet, but you have to find an art school, find out how to get into an art school. So I sent off letters and nothing came back. And then ultimately, I honestly don't remember how it happened now, but I got a place in the art school. Then I needed money to go, and then I got a Lever-Hume scholarship to go. You needed a Japanese citizen as a sponsor for a visa, and of course I'd never met a Japanese person. Anyway, ultimately it all lined up, and I flew off in 1979.
I mean, you used the word romantic. Was it a sense of, pretty surprising adventure? You were seizing an adventure there. Yeah. It wasn't going a well-trodden path. No. Were there any models of people who you'd seen going to Japan, artists who'd been influenced by Japan?
I didn't know anybody, and of course I arrived in Japan and I didn't know anybody. I didn't speak Japanese. I mean, I'd gone to the only evening class in London at the time, which was at City Lit. And I'd learnt very little, to be honest, because it wasn't particularly well taught. So, I mean, it was a massive adventure, the sort of adventure you probably tell your parents about after you've done it. But off I went, basically.
So you went to Japan to train further as a ceramicist, if I'm not wrong. And
well, I specifically went to, because I'd been doing a lot of low-fired ceramics, I specifically went to look at raku tea bowls, although I'd never made a tea bowl. And there is an exhibition at the moment, which I haven't seen yet, but at Annalee Judah, which combines tea bowls by the current raku master and Malevich, which I think will be very interesting. So I went to study that.
You went for 2 years, you stayed 6 years?
Well, it was initially 1 year. My scholarship was 1 year, and I sort of said, well, this is fine, but actually it's pretty hard to learn the language and learn everything you need to know in a year. So they very kindly extended it for a year. So I had 2 years in the university, and then I had 4 years just doing my own work.
And you headed not to Tokyo, but to Kyoto, quite a city that's preserved traditions, but also had some avant-garde.
It had some avant-garde, but of course, raku is at the very heart of the tea ceremony. And when we're talking about Kyoto traditions and really sort of traditional traditions, the tea ceremony is way up there. So it was quite a hard, difficult world to get into.
I mean, I think, and I'll just say for the audience and the audience online, that we're showing a selection of works from across Rebecca's career. Some earlier works from, I think, the mid-'80s, right through a few from the 90s, right through to far more recent works. But I'm still interested to delve into this. I mean, in a sense, it sounds like you went to Japan as a researcher rather than necessarily someone who was going to be a maker. What were you making in Japan?
So I was... so my scholarship was to go and research the history of raku. And so I was trying to do, proper research, and then also I built 2 kilns so that I could make, and I collected, so for example, the black raku tea bowls use a stone that's in the river that runs through the middle of Kyoto. So I get the stones and I crush them and I make all the glazes and then I fire them. And the same with the red raku bowls, you collect earth and you do. So I did all that stuff. And I actually I mean, in the first year, I learnt to speak Japanese and write it a bit, but I also learnt to read Japanese so I could read the contemporary books, but also the older records were pre-war Japanese, so I learnt to read pre-war Japanese so I could do earlier research. So I did all that I was sort of required to do for my scholarship, but as I was doing it, I realised that, you know what, I really didn't want to make tea bowls.
I'm staying with Japan because of that sense of you know, it's something that you've often spoken about. Your research into Japanese culture, Japanese art, calligraphy continued even after you'd come back from Japan in the mid-80s. When did you start learning the calligraphic mark making and how to use the brushes?
So when I first arrived in Japan, I actually lived with a Japanese family for a year, and it was my Japanese family that taught me everything. They taught me to speak, to read, and to read pre-war Japanese. And my Japanese mother, as I call her, she took me off to flower arranging lessons that she went to, and she also took me to calligraphy lessons. So I went off to learn calligraphy with her. And of course, you're in this position whereby you're learning how to write characters, but actually at that stage you still can't read them. You know, you have no idea what they are. And so you're trying to understand the deeper meaning of the word before you even really understand it. And it was incredibly difficult for me to develop any kind of sense as to whether this was any good or not. Because normally when you draw something as an artist, you think, well, that's okay. But when you're working in that calligraphic tradition, you look at it and you think, well, it looks okay to me, but what do I know? And then you show it to the teacher and she gets her sort of red brush out and covers it in red, and you think, oh, well, obviously it's not very good. But you don't know why it's not very good yet. It's like learning a foreign language.
But you're learning, it's the accent or the nuance of how thick your stroke
how
is.
Strokes and what sort of speed you're working in, and also the style. You know, I was learning from a particular teacher who had a particular style, so to some extent you would be following her style, but to follow her style, which was slightly deconstructed, you also ought to know how you should do it properly, which of course I didn't know at that stage. So it was a very interesting experience because of course you're completely outside any kind of parameters that you've functioned in before.
And you're outside the world of what's going on in the London art scene at that time,
Yes.
and you're outside, you know, the macho New York art scene as well.
And also looking back on it, I realised that also, I mean, if you look at the Gutai movement, which is now reaching more prominence in the West, you know, I was sort of at the tail end of, I mean, it had finished by then, by the sort of early 70s, but, you know, this was the late 70s. So there were those sort of resonances still around.
So, I mean, thinking about some of the works that we've been showing on screen, I mean, this work is an early work that I can see some of the perhaps inheritance of what it is to paint on screens, but not so much just painting on screens, spatial arrangements that are created by screens.
Well, this series, a lot of the work I did in the sort of my last 2 years in Japan came out of, I started to do translation work for a Japanese professor who, I mean, actually, he was really a professor of French literature, but he'd become very interested in, I don't know what you'd call it in English, but in Japanese it's called Nihonjinron, which is like theory of being Japanese, and it was very popular. In the 80s, Japan was powering ahead economically, and every airport bookshop was full of books saying, you know, Japan is #1, you know, the West is finished, America's had it, and all those books. So within Japan, there was a huge amount of debate.
It was a sort of nationalist critique, though.
It was sort of, well, how did that happen? Why are we so special? What's so different about Japan? And he became one of the leading sort of commentators in that field. And I used to go to all his talks that he gave in Japan. And then he was invited, I think he was invited to go and teach in Canada. So he needed all his lectures to be in English. So I translated them all for him. And we spent a lot of time discussing the use of space, both sort of domestic space in Japan and particularly divisions within sacred space, and how, for example, subtle differences in how important and sacred the space is can be as much as sort of the different size of gravel or something, or a kind of different rope. And, if you think of that kind of sacred space when you come from kind of effectively Westminster Abbey, it's just a completely different mindset. And so I did a whole series of works, of which that drawing was one, which was about very, very subtle differences of texture and colour and marks.
So I suppose this approach to mark making and to the meaningfulness of individual marks, the possibilities of chance as you make marks, is something of your legacy of that time. But I wonder also, to ask a big question really, whether, in a sense, one of the things you learned in that 6-year period, or you carried forward as your work developed and as you became really a painter, printmaker, working as two-dimensional works, is a mindset, whether that's what really had changed. I mean, would you say that's
I think
the case?
there's a completely different mindset, attitude to materials, and attitude to surface. But before that, just to go back to what we were saying about calligraphy, there is a fundamental difference between the line in the East and the line in the West, because the highest art form in the East is the calligraphic line. And effectively, that's a word. And so the line has an inherent meaning to it, whereas the Western line is kind of sort of descriptive. It's sort of outlining something to make itself something. So that is a really essential difference in the line. So that I still find interesting. What did you say?
Well, I suppose I was
yes,
carrying the sort of
materials,
mindset,
yes.
and to some degree, it's to allow me to almost fast forward to where we are now. And I do want to come back to these ideas of abstraction and materiality, but to sort of think about how you now approach making works in the studio, to think about, to give our audience a sense in which, how do you approach the making of art?
So I have moved almost completely to painting, but I sort of moved, I dropped the third dimension with ceramics and I moved into 2 dimensions, and I made that move using Japanese paper. And there is again a fundamental difference between Japanese paper and Western paper in that the fibers are much longer, and so you can make the paper wet and it doesn't distort in the same way, and then it dries again. So it's incredibly versatile. But for me, one of the most important parts of it was that it's translucent. Thin paper is translucent. So you can actually treat that substrate as an object, so you can work on the back and on the front. And whatever you see is almost being mediated through the fibers of the paper, which I still enjoy working on Japanese paper, but yet again you come up against the problem of it, only comes in sheets this big, and then you have to frame it, which means putting glass on it, and that's difficult. So I wanted to find a way to move on to, I work primarily now on linen, and how do I get that feeling of making an object on both sides, but using linen. So one of the pictures that comes up on this screen, I've actually, the entire painting was done on the back, and then I turned it round at the last minute and made the back the front. So you get the feeling that something's beyond and behind.
And just to sort of place you in the studio, without maybe fetishizing the studio too much, you work in North London. Quite a light studio. Obviously, and we'll come to the RA, how you balance your roles. But when you're in the studio, is everything else shut out? Are you only working on one, we'll call them paintings, quote unquote, but one work at a time, making
it tends
marks?
to be, it depends. Sometimes I'm working on ones which get very wet, and then you have to let them dry, so I work on, but I tend to work on one at a time. And people think the studio is very tidy, but I never show them what it's like behind the scenes in the drawers. It's not tidy at all. But Yes, I mean, it is pared back, I suppose, because when you're dealing with this level of sort of delicacy of mark making, you can't have too much sort of extraneous noise.
So time, I guess, is one of the subjects of the work,
yeah.
because some of these works, and specifically perhaps some of the more recent ones, have thousands, if not tens of thousands of tiny marks
That's
on
the
them.
one that's on the back, by the way. That's the one that was all done on the reverse. And that's the front of the painting is the back.
And you're making the mark that is the same but different each time, again.
Yeah.
I mean, are you totally in that space and time of the painting when you're doing it? Do you have to block everything else out?
You have to block everything else out, because if you even for a minute think, if I can finish this section by 2 o'clock, then the nature of the marks change. So you have to go for each individual and think, well, if this takes me all week, so be it. And you have to completely give yourself over to that process.
What does the first mark look like? How do you decide what the first mark is? And
well, I do a lot of sort of messing around with sort of, I mean, I don't actually use traditional brushes. I buy a lot of things in pound shops that I work with.
I saw you, I mean, you use what, cocktail sticks
sticks and chopstick, anything I find to paint with. Because what I like about those sort of devices, if that's the right word, is that there is that element of jeopardy. So you can never be 100% sure that the next mark is going to be like the one before. And again, to some extent, that goes back to, if we go back to calligraphy, if you are a master of calligraphy, you practice for decades, and then you reach the stage when you can do it perfectly, and then the most important thing you've got to do at that point is start to not do it perfectly, because otherwise it dies.
So that's what the character of is wabi, the
well,
word,
it's sort of
the
unlearning, and it's keeping also that element of not 100% control. And also, I mean, I was once told that in the East, you should always leave something in a picture which is not 100% right, because it's from that bit that's a little bit wrong that's the seed of the next. So basically, perfection is your enemy, sort of.
How do you know when something has gone so wrong that you've made a mistake? And
I mean, there are occasions when it goes. I mean, there are not that many, but there are occasions when I think it's not. And then I tend to do things that are really quite radical, like sort of put black all over it and start again, or pour a bucket of water over it or something and see what happens.
I mean, thinking about repetition, it's one way to think about repetition is that it creates can create a different mental state. So if you think about a chant or a song, when a poet is using a refrain, typically that's been the possibilities of repeating something actually almost can have an animistic effect on the world. If you say something enough times over and over, if someone says a spell in a children's story, it changes something in the world. I mean, is there a sense that you're entering a meditative state, not catatonic, or a...
I think there's a difference between repetition, where you kind of carry on doing the same thing, whereas I think my kind of repetition is actually, I don't know, the action is the same, but the thing is different. So, you're keeping a difference between what you're doing rather than, it's not copying, it's repeating the action.
It's like rhyme rather than, so rhyme where something is similar but different each time.
Yes, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about your materials and the quality of them. I mean, you're always looking for new materials to challenge yourself, or do you feel like you've settled on materials now? You said you're mostly working on linen, sometimes on Japanese paper.
I quite like not to have too many options. So I really, so when I had a residency at the Albers Foundation back in 2003, which was a wonderful 3 months in a wood, in a studio in the wood, actually on the grounds of the foundation, with only occasional access to a car, it meant that I had to work with what was there. And I really quite liked, you know, running out of everything, which happened one Sunday afternoon, and actually going through the cupboards and thinking, oh, well, I could paint with that. And I like those kind of restrictions.
And the materials you work with are often quite delicate, quite fragile, and yet you have your mark making can be very delicate, but you also sometimes will do something, if not quite violent, quite dramatic to the work. I mean, are you prepared? You're prepared for surfaces to break or for water to soak through. You're not like Alberto Burri. You're not trying to burn holes or create.
Oh, I might.
But sometimes you have
I
put
have done
holes
burnt
in.
ones. Yes, I have done burnt ones. I quite like. It's a sort of slight sort of sadness you get when you had something that was quite nice, and then you do something else, and it's not quite as nice. And I quite like that moment of sadness when you mourn what you had, which seemed okay if only you hadn't gone and done something on top of it. But then you've got the thing, well, okay, I've done something. Now what am I going to do with it? And then I quite like the fact that I'm the only one that knows what's under there.
But is that to say that it could have been finished before?
Yes, it could have been finished before. But you always think, I wonder what would happen if I did that. And then you think, oh, well, I shouldn't have done that, really.
Because these works can take weeks. I mean, to make that months. So to take that extra step.
Because you do all that work, and then one falls, and you've lost it.
But the risk isn't necessarily, they have quite a, dare I say, calming appearance if people take the time to come to them, just to engage with their limitations, their restrictions, and their surfaces, and the possibilities of. I mean, do you want that to be people to be able to suspend their attention in them?
I think there's a link between the time they take me to do and the time I'd like people to look at them. But I think we're operating in a world where attention spans are quite short, and also they're not particularly good on screen. They're difficult. You lose so much of the.
We've talked about this. You're not an artist who makes art for Instagram.
No, I'm not.
Although you do have a really interesting Instagram account, which has increasingly moved towards your photographs,
which is
just captioned morning, evening.
Possible picture of a dog occasionally.
But that's the photos you're taking, and they are similar to photos you took at the Yale Centre for British Art. They have a quality of looking for simple patterns, often monochrome. Yeah. I mean, what are some of the recent things that you have put on Instagram?
Oh, they're mostly things I come across. I don't know. One of the recent ones was that. My sink in the studio over the 20 years has got this wonderful patina.
It's rivulets.
And you just think, oh, that's nice. But that was, interestingly, a lot of that came out of the first few weeks of the first lockdown. Because what I discovered it was a really strange experience. Because I would go on my sort of daily allowance, which was to go out you were allowed out, weren't you, once a day on your bike. So I would go out on my bike. And I may or may not have ended up at the studio.
Were you allowed to do that?
Was I allowed to do that?
You were allowed to go to your workplace,
I was going to my workplace. And I suddenly rediscovered the sort of looking which I remembered having as a student when I was on foundation, when you did the photography, for 2 weeks of photography, and they gave you a camera, and I'd not had a camera before. And also I remembered that in those days, because you didn't have that access to cameras, it was just incredible to be just looking in that way. And bizarrely, that just suddenly reappeared in lockdown, and I'd have gone past that fence every day for
one of the
years.
things that you're seeing, dare I say it, is things that look quite like some of your work, and you're seeing patterns, repetition. I
Yeah.
mean, what is a pattern if not repetition with difference?
Yeah.
And
Texture.
you're seeing texture and monochrome, but also the variations of grey
Yes.
and the possibilities of color not used exuberantly, but used very carefully and sparingly.
Yeah.
I mean, I see landscapes in some of those
I know.
photos, which allows me to shift questions, because you have got another, it's not another practice, but there is something that you do. You do take a sketchbook
I do.
to the Lake District every year, and have done for quite a few years, and you fill it in a certain
I fill it in a certain
number of days. So
every year we go back to the same part of the same place in the Lake District for about, I think, 13 more years now. And I just take a sketchbook and something in the beginning, I actually used to take a full set of watercolours, but then I got completely overwhelmed by setting it all up, and then it rains and it got too difficult. So now I just take Japanese calligraphy ink, which, I mean, people often ask why I don't work in colour, and it's partly because there are so many colours in Japanese Eastern calligraphy ink that I haven't got to grips with them, let alone anything else. And then I just use either my fingers or a stick or anything I find, and I just do really, really quick, 30-second.
but they are sketches of the weather, the atmosphere, the place.
The weather and the atmosphere, but the even though it sounds boring, but going back to the same place every time means that your knowledge of the landscape deepens every year. And so it's like meeting an old friend. You can pick up where you left off. You don't have to go through all the niceties at the beginning. Whereas if I went to a different part of the Lake District, I'd have to start to get to know those mountains again.
But I know that you have in the past done landscape or sketched. There was a London sketchbook at one point.
There was, yeah.
You've sketched in Yemen when you were able to travel to Sana'a, and they're not how to say, they're not like Bomberg doing the mud architecture and so on. They're more abstracted, those sketches. What do you feel that is the relationship between these sketches that have figurative moments and the work that we're showing on the screen and you work in the studio?
Unfortunately, it's very specific. So there are a lot of places where I wish I could do a sketchbook, but actually I don't. It doesn't appeal to me, like the south of England. Sounds awful, but I want to go north. I went to north of Norway again, which was wonderful. It's if there's something that just fascinates me about, whether it's the landscape or in Yemen it was the extraordinary architecture. And then it's just that joy, very briefly, of going back to just looking and seeing and drawing. And then I don't ever look at them again. When I take them back to the studio, I just put them away in a cupboard.
So there's a freedom there, and perhaps we can come on to think about just in terms of, I said we'd come back to abstraction. It is a bit of a leap, but I suppose you're flirting with figuration in those sketchbooks.
Yes.
Whereas here, I mean, it would be easy for people to simplify art history and say, okay, this is a type of abstraction that comes out of a New Mexico tradition or Agnes Martin and so on, but you're not really working in that tradition of abstraction. You're not working in the tradition where
I don't know where
the line is the end in itself, or sort of Bryce Marden and so on, or the Abex thing where what's happening within the plane is somehow answering a question of its own making.
No. I mean, I think they come out of the strange sort of genesis, really, of this whole business of going to Japan, doing one thing and then unlearning it and learning something else, but coming away with an attitude to materials that is, I mean, I think there is a different attitude to the surface because, again, in the East, you've got an absorbent surface in paper or silk and water-based pigments. So the surface you're working with is receptive automatically, where if you think of a Western primed canvas, the whole point is that the paint just kind of sits on it. And they don't really have a great deal to do with each other, except one is supporting the other. But, you know, in the Eastern tradition, they fuse and become an object. So I think, I mean, I still think I am actually making objects, but they just happen to look like a painting.
Some of those American artists, I mean, in your big Yale catalogue, there are sort of comparative images. There's a Gray Richter or a Gray Jasper Johns.
Yeah.
There's possibly an Agnes Martin. I mean, do you feel an affinity with any of those artists in terms of the version, what they're trying to do with?
I think probably Agnes Martin the most, and I think, I mean, there's obviously the work, but also I really like reading the way she writes about the process of her work. I like that there's a very personal and very individual. I mean, I feel when she writes about her work, I always feel that as if she's writing about her work for herself rather than for an audience, and I think that it's very reflective, her writing. Which I find.
Do you write?
I don't. No, not about my work. No. Not if I can help it.
I mean,
I need people like you.
I could ask you about your work for another 20 minutes, and then all the time would be gone. But I want to ask you about what's happened in the last sort of 5 years of your career as well, because it also strikes me that there's a contrast between this work that demands time. It demands time of you to make it, and it demands time of anyone approaching it as a viewer to engage with it and to find a way in which you can think about the marks, about its objectness, about its sparing colours. But you became the keeper of the Royal Academy Schools in 2017.
Yeah.
And in 2019, you were elected as the first woman to be president of the Royal Academy, and not before time.
250 something years.
But without pressing home on that point, I mean, the president of the Royal Academy, it's not just a ceremonial position, is it? And certainly not during a pandemic.
No.
So how have you found that as a way, first of all, in terms of just balancing your identity as an artist with your identity as president of the Royal Academy?
Well, it's been pretty punishing because, as you say, the work I do requires uninterrupted time, which I've had next to none since I was elected. The only upside of the way I work is that, well, I don't know why, but I mean, I am able to sort of focus and do so. I mean, I was in my studio this morning for an hour. So I can go there. And because of the way I work, you know, for some people you'd have just mixed the paints. But because of the nature of the way I work, I can pick something up for an hour and leave it.
So there's a sort of distillation, the time that is available
Yeah.
has to be a very intense time.
Very, very intense. I mean, in terms of being president, my problem is I've no idea what it's like being president not in a crisis. So I have no idea, really.
You're a keeper. I mean, you were elected in 2014 as a Royal Academician, as one of the printmaking cohort, and yet, you know, you said you see yourself as an object maker.
But the categories are very, very fluid, because I mean, Grayson Perry is elected as a printmaker. My predecessor, Christopher Lebrun, also elected as a printmaker. So the categories are.
So if you want to be a president of the Royal Academy, you have to come in as a printmaker.
Yes.
I mean,
mafia.
And tell me, I mean, in terms of some of the challenges, I mean, there are a lot of different parts of the Royal Academy. Sometimes there have been silos, but there is a managerial aspect to what you're doing. There's a figurehead aspect and a representation. You're representing other artists. But you're also representing the institution to, I suppose, government, to its audience and so on. Is that something that you felt automatically comfortable with, or you've...
It's a surprise to me, frankly, but, you know, I've ended up doing, I mean, I'm getting to grips with it, put it that way. I mean, it is a big old beast to juggle, because it's so... just when you think, well, that bit's going okay, something happens over here. You know, there's so many moving parts.
Did you think about turning it down when you were elected?
Well, I think I don't know what would happen actually, because if you stand, people assume you'd say yes. I don't know what, there'd be a crisis, I think, if you got elected and then said no.
I'm sorry, of course, you have to stand in the first instance.
You have to stand in the first instance.
You would be having second thoughts, yeah. And what, I mean, do you think that your work can be part of your role as PRA? I mean, I say this, but we've been speaking about it.
Yeah.
You know, the type of work you make and your attitude to your work could sort of inform your attitude to the role of being president.
I mean, what's happened, oddly, is that the longer I've been president, the more of a hermit I've become in relation to the work. I don't know, it's almost as if I've retreated. And that, I think part of that is that, you know, so much of the job is talking about art, advocating for art, talking about art education, advocating for art education, advocating for the work of my fellow academicians, you know, exhibitions for my fellow academicians, exhibitions we should put on as an academy, that I actually think, oh, enough. You know, I don't want to.
So has the studio become in some ways an escape?
An escape and a haven, and I, you know, I don't even show the work to anybody in particular. I just make it and put it away.
Well, I should say there are two of Rebecca's works on show at the fair at Patrick Hyder's stand. So anyone who wants to see a work in person and see the surface must go there and see that after this conversation. I mean, we've been talking for about 45 minutes. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience, whether in person here in the room or online. I will look here and see if anything pops up. I don't think there's anything now. Yes, there's a question in the front row, and perhaps if you wait for the microphone to arrive.
Thank you so much. You were talking quite a bit about sort of looking and seeing and taking time to look, and I was wondering how much you think about the audience's looking while you're creating your works. I hope that there might be an audience for what you might call slow work. It's very difficult in the current climate. I mean, I think in the digital age, to persuade people to slow down, and also, I mean, I think my work also shows that it's important to see the real artwork, because during lockdown, people would occasionally say to me, whether they wanted to cheer me up or not, I don't know. You know, when the Royal Academy was closed, they'd say, well, actually, you know, in the future, everybody will look at everything online. And I used to think, really? Surely not. And of course, you know, work like mine, and I mean, looking at all these beautiful works here, I mean, it's okay to see them online, but we do all want to experience. And I think above all else, as a viewer, you want to have the opportunity to stand a few feet away from the object where the artist stood when they were working on it. And you can't, sadly, you can't do that online.
Rebecca, just picking that up, I mean, I suppose two questions to follow on. One is the extent to which your work has been received and discussed in Japan, given that it has been so formational, both in that period in the 80s, but also you've gone back to Japan most years pre-pandemic. So that's that one first. Yeah.
That one first. Well, this is another interesting fact. So because I started working like this when I was living in Japan, I'd only ever spoken about because by then, you know, I'd been in Japan for 5 or 6 years, so I hardly used English at all. I was living in, you know, completely Japanese world. And so I'd only ever spoken about my work in Japanese. And there are some words in Japanese which means that it's really easy to speak about my kind of work. Then, of course, I moved back here and I had to speak about this work in English, which still is much more difficult than it is in Japanese. So when I had an exhibition there back in 2019, I think, and that was the first time in ages, and all of a sudden I was in a room
speaking about my work in Japanese, and it was sort of like time travel. And there's something about it that makes it click.
Because the language that you have for thinking
And
about your
also
work and
there's
the technical
The aesthetic,
language.
it's an aesthetic language, it's an understanding of this aesthetic, which just goes without saying.
The second question, though, is about a public work, because I'm going to get the date wrong, but about 15 years ago, you created a large architectural installation for St George's Hospital in Tooting, which has thousands of people passing by it every single day and seeing it. And it's partly bamboo panels with lights set in this long wall in the reception area of the hospital. So I just wondered whether how you thought about the audience for that work.
Well, that, in many ways, that is the biggest piece of work to come out of my long-standing obsession with division and Japanese space, because when I was first asked by the arts officer at St George's Hospital, they were planning to redevelop the main entrance, which is, you know, it's a major London hospital. 10,000 people go in and out every day. So it's like a small town, in effect. And they were going to renovate it. And she said, I mean, she started it with, you know, we haven't got any money, but what about one of your paintings behind the desk? And so I said to her, because I hate hospitals, I said, look, I don't think anybody ever feels better going into a pretty grim hospital space if you've just got a picture behind the desk. It just doesn't help. So how about working with the architect on the whole space? So rather naughtily, we stole the money they'd got to make a 19-metre curved wall. And I, as Tom said, I covered it with a combination of bamboo veneered in very different directions, and then strips of recycled glass lit from behind with LEDs. So the whole aim of the space was so that you could navigate it intuitively, because before it was one of those horrible spaces where you walked in the door, probably in a state of panic, either because you were ill or because you were late, or both, and you saw one of those classic NHS signboards with arrows that did that, and you had no idea where to go. So the idea was that people would, and we started outside in the garden with lights, and you would actually find your way in intuitively, quite calmly, and there would be an information desk that would tell you where to go. And it was very interesting what it did, because it completely kind of lowered the temperature of that space. And it opened it out in a way, because I worked with sort of some of the pictorial tricks that Japanese picture scrolls work with, to widen the corridors. So halfway along, I put more horizontal ones in or something. So as you walked along, you felt that the space opened out and then it closed in again. But those were just
a sort of
tricks.
Baroque, like you're the Borromini of hospital architecture.
Of Tooting, yeah.
And 10,000 people see that every day, and that's
Well, and it was also very interesting because there's a lot of, you know, people are always very keen to put art in hospitals. And they assume two things. One is that the most important people in work in the hospital building are patients. The truth is, nowadays, very few people stay in hospital for weeks and weeks and weeks. Most people are in and out in a day now. And so they don't necessarily need... So actually, the people who really need a decent environment are the people who go to work in these hospitals every day. And they also assume, a lot of people who put art in hospitals assume that the work must be jolly. And of course, that it's not necessarily, you know, not everything in hospitals.
It's not mood lift, it's mood changing, mood transforming.
So we had a lot of discussions about what message, by doing this work on the main entrance, what was the message we were trying to give, not only to people who might come and work there, but also the patients. And in the end, it wasn't, well, hey, this is a fun place to work or whatever. It was, by designing this entrance like this, we've put a huge amount of thought into it. We've done it professionally. We've used beautiful materials. That means that we value you and everybody that comes to this building. So it was a subliminal message, which was not as simple as let's put a jolly picture on the wall
But I
and cheer
think
everybody
that
up.
I think that that is an extension of your practice, the quality of care for everything
Yeah.
that you do in your works. We have got a question online, which I found in the chat box, which is a question about how far, as the president of the Royal Academy, you're able to extend your influence or have a particular influence. In particular, this question is interested in how far you might bring a diversity of cultures and ethnicities to the RA in terms of what's shown there. What sort of what power do you have?
Well, the good news is that, I mean, as president, I suppose I could issue a diktat, but actually I don't need to issue a diktat because the Royal Academy is doing a huge amount of work on this very topic. And I was particularly keen because obviously all organisations after the Black Lives Matter, when was that, 2020, wasn't it? All organisations were tasked with looking at themselves, or tasked themselves with looking at themselves. And I was very determined that our reaction wouldn't be just something on the website that said, we all know this is terrible and all the rest of it, that it needed to be meaningful. So since then we've got what we call internally Ways In groups, which is looking at different areas of the Royal Academy. How can we broaden our reach? How can we bring in different kinds of art? How we can bring in all sorts of people. So
I'm going to ask you a far more selfish question, or question more about egotisms and egos. If you were able to curate a show in the galleries at the Royal Academy of an art, what would you curate?
God, now that's really a tough
What's
one.
your instinct?
What's my instinct? Well, I know the painting I'd like to, well, I know the screens I would like to have, but they'd never let them out of Japan.
And what are they?
Well, they're a pair of screens by Hasegawa Tohaku from the 17th century, and they're just so beautiful, but they're so precious. So I'd have them.
They have subjects on them?
I've forgotten what the title is, but I call them Lonesome Pine, actually. But they're exquisitely beautiful, mostly because he was a master of white space, and very few people on the planet nowadays would have the confidence to leave that much white space, and there he was back in 17th century.
There's another question in the room.
Thank you. Hi. I was going to ask about scale in your work. So when you're making a work, do you start off thinking about the scale? Because your work does fluctuate between larger work and smaller. And is that something that perhaps influenced you in Japan, the scale?
Yes, so because I work on them flat, so all the canvases are unstretched, so I work leaning across a table. So this triptych, for example, has to be a triptych because I can't reach the middle otherwise. So there's all sorts of really tedious practical reasons for why they are the way they are. I tend to, so at the moment what I've decided I'm going to do is work on a few large pieces each year, because what I didn't want to happen was that I would end up, when I am no longer president, I would have a cupboard full of little ones, which is all I'd managed. And I just thought that would be too depressing. So I work on large ones. And because of the way I make them, they're all incredibly calculated and measured out. So I have to know exactly what size they're going to end up. So they are a bit calculated in advance.
There's a further question here, and then perhaps we'll...
Thank you. Thanks. It was great to hear you both talk. I was just quite interested in the fact that you put your sketchbooks away and you never look at them again. And I was thinking about you talking about rediscovering photography and looking in that kind of way through a lens or through a frame in lockdown. And obviously, if you know, when you're going back to Instagram, you are seeing those things again, and you're going back to them and repeatedly. Do you think that is having some kind of impact on your work now?
I think the reason I don't look at the sketchbooks again, and I actually don't look at Instagram again either, is that that was a moment, and I don't particularly want, you know, so I want the painting moment I will be in when I'm back in the studio. So it's not, the sketchbooks are not really for reference, they're for just capturing that moment, and that you know, as the week goes on, the sort of hand-eye coordination gets a bit better, and then it sort of tails off again towards the end of the week. Because again, you see, you're in that strange trajectory, so when you first arrive, you think, oh, there's that mountain again. Oh, yeah, I remember how I did that last year. And you do it again, and you think, well, that's boring. That's how I did it last year. So then you go on an experiment. You go on a little journey, perhaps with a twig that you found. And then you think, well, actually, I'm getting too good at doing that twig now, so I'm getting bored with that. And I'll start again. So there's a trajectory, but each one is just a moment, and when it's over, it's over.
And when it's over, it's over. Yes. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you all for coming, and thank you for those of you watching online, and thank you above all to Rebecca Salter for joining me this evening in conversation.
Well, thank you.